Oops, forgot our wallet again, Sylvia said, and then she laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not even a real laugh. It was the kind of sound you make when you already know the answer and the question is just a formality. Philip lifted his beer glass toward me. Thanks, Dad. You always come through. The waiter set the check folder at my elbow, same spot every time like he had measured it. He did not ask, did not look at anyone else at the table. Just placed it there and stepped back. He already knew how this worked. We all did. My name is Leonard Hadley. 63 years old, retired civil engineer, and that night, with that little leather folder sitting next to my water glass, I had already made up my mind. I looked at it for a second. Then I said quietly, how strange this time, so did I. Sylvia's laugh cut off. Not all at once. More like someone turned a dial down slow. Philip blinked. The two kids kept working on their coloring pages, completely unaware that anything had shifted. Well, I said, if you need a minute to sort it out, I can wait outside. I folded my napkin and set it on the table, pushed back my chair, stood up. My coat was already over the back of the seat. I had put it there when I first sat down. I had not ordered dessert, had not finished my water. None of that was an accident. Philip opened his mouth, then closed it. Sylvia glanced toward the waiter, who had already taken a quiet half-step back from the table. The way someone does when they realize they are standing too close to something about to go sideways. I'll see you both later, I said. One nod, then I turned and walked out. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected. I stood on the sidewalk with my hands in my coat pockets and just listened for a minute. Voices inside, the clink of glasses, a woman laughing at a table near the window. I was not angry. I was not relieved either. Not yet. I was just still. The way you feel after you have finally done something you should have done a long time ago. I stood there maybe 10 minutes. Then I walked to my car, 2 blocks away, and drove home without turning on the radio. 3 hours earlier, I was already at the table when they arrived. I had asked the hostess for a booth near the window, somewhere I could see the parking lot and not feel hemmed in by noise. She did not question it. I suppose I looked like a man with a preference. Sylvia had picked the restaurant. She always picked the restaurant. This one was a new steakhouse downtown, the kind of place where the steaks come out on wooden boards and the cocktails have names printed in small font like they are trying not to brag. She had texted me the address the evening before with just the time. No question mark. No, does that work for you? Just the address and 7 p.m. like a calendar invite. They were 14 minutes late. I know because I checked my watch when I sat down and again when the door opened. Sylvia came in first, wearing something that looked expensive in a way that was meant to seem effortless. Philip followed with his phone already in his hand, reading something. The kids trailed in behind them, arguing over who got the window seat. Nobody said sorry for being late. Hope you weren't waiting long, Sylvia said, sliding into the booth without looking at me directly. Not at all, I said. The waiter came, and they ordered like they had been there a dozen times. Appetizers for the table without asking if I wanted any. 2 cocktails. The ribeye for Philip, scallops for Sylvia, something with truffle on it for the kids to pick at and leave. I asked for the grilled chicken and water with no ice. I had looked up the menu on my phone before I left the house. Old habit, I like to know what things cost before I'm sitting across from them. Somewhere in the past 3 years, my seat at these dinners had changed. I used to be the father at the table. Somewhere along the way, I became the guy who covers the bill. It did not happen with a conversation. There was no moment where someone looked at me and said, "You're paying for everything from here on out." It just settled in, the way sediment does. One dinner, one favor, one automatic assumption stacked on top of the last one until it was just understood. The check comes, it goes to Leonard. I sat there that evening and watched them eat. Listened to Sylvia talk about a preschool wait list and how unreasonable the fees were at the place they wanted. Listened to Philip explain a work situation that had been ongoing for at least 6 months. Something about a promotion that was always 1 quarter away. I nodded at the right times. I asked a follow-up question or two. I smiled when the grandkids held up their coloring pages to show me, but I did not reach for my wallet. I just sat with that for a while, long enough to feel sure about it. Then I folded my napkin, set it on the table, and waited for the check to come. When I got home that night, I took off my shoes at the door, set my keys on the counter, and opened my laptop. No TV, no radio. Just the kitchen light and the low hum of the refrigerator. The emergency card had already been charged, $612.45. It had not even been 2 hours since I walked out of that restaurant. I sat with that number for a moment. The card was one I had added to my account about 2 years back, after Sylvia mentioned they were between banks and needed something temporary for a few weeks. I kept it in a separate slot in my wallet and told myself it was just for genuine emergencies. Car breaks down on the highway. Kid gets hurt. Something real. 6112.45 at a home goods store at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday was not that. I scrolled back through the recent transactions. 3 weeks ago, $320 transferred to Sylvia's account. She had texted me the morning of, "Groceries are brutal right now, you know how it is." I did not know how it was, because I shopped for one person and planned ahead, but I sent the money anyway. 2 weeks before that, $190 to a vet clinic across town. Their dog, not mine, I had never met their dog. Before that, $480 to a spa Sylvia described as essential for her migraines. She had sent the payment request with a winking emoji and the words, "Daddy, you are a lifesaver." No repayment on any of it, not even a mention. I pulled up the file. Hadley Family Expenses XSX. I had been keeping it for about 2 years, ever since I noticed the pattern starting to solidify. Each row was a date. Each column had a category: car repairs, phone bills, school supplies, medical, household, other. The colors were mine, a system I had built over decades of tracking project budgets. Green for reimbursed, yellow for pending, red for written off. There was almost no green in the file. I scrolled to the bottom and typed a new line. March 28 dinner, 5 people $0 reimbursed. Formatted the font to match the rest. Hit save, then I added up the past 90 days, the groceries, the vet, the spa, a few smaller transfers I had almost forgotten about. The total came to $990, not counting the emergency card charge from tonight. I stared at that number for a while. Then I opened a second document and started writing out what I was going to do next. It was not the first time I had thought about it, but it was the first time I sat down and actually listed the steps. A week before that dinner, Philip had sent me a text with no greeting and no context. Just, "Car needs repair, can you cover? No please." No explanation of what was wrong or how much. I read it twice, waiting for a follow-up message that never came. I set the phone down, finished rinsing the mug I was holding, and stared out the window for a while. Then I paid it, $340 to an auto shop on the east side. I did not tell him I had done it. I never did with any of them. The confirmation email went into a folder I had labeled household, because I still had not made a separate folder just for their expenses. I kept telling myself I would do it later. I always told myself that, about a month before the dinner, I logged into my utilities account to update a payment method. That was when I found it. A second address, listed under my name, not mine. Theirs, I had to read it 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. At some point, I must have agreed to cover 1 month of their electric bill while they sorted something out. That 1 month had been running on auto pay ever since. 5 months of payments, none of which I had noticed because the amount was absorbed into a larger auto pay total I never broke down line by line. I did not handle that at home. I drove to the public library, sat down at one of the computers in the back corner, and spent nearly 4 hours on the phone with customer service. I reset passwords. I confirmed my identity over and over. I was put on hold 4 separate times, each with the same loop of music that repeated every 90 seconds. Every time I confirmed who I was, I felt a low-grade irritation I could not fully name, not anger exactly. Something closer to exhaustion at having to prove that my own account belonged to me. When I finally removed the automatic payment, the screen just refreshed and went blank. No confirmation message, no acknowledgement, just the absence of a link that should not have been there in the first place. That night, Philip sent a single text, "Thanks, nothing else." I set the phone face down on the table and sat in the quiet for a long time. They had not pushed me here deliberately. I understood that. They had not sat down and planned to take advantage of me. What they had done was simpler and harder to argue with. They had tested the limits and found out there were none. Every yes I gave made the next ask feel smaller. Every time I picked up the check without saying anything, I was telling them the check was mine to pick up. I had built this situation the same way they had. One quiet agreement at a time, but I was 63 years old. I had worked for 38 years. I had earned what I had, planned carefully, and lived within my means, and I was tired of watching it drain out through a hole I had never agreed to put there. I closed the laptop, went to bed, did not fall asleep for a long time. 6 weeks before that dinner, I drove to a branch of my bank on a Wednesday morning and opened a new checking account. No joint access, no secondary card holder. Just my name, my pension direct deposit, and a debit card that went into the inside pocket of my wallet where nobody would see it. The woman at the desk asked if I was consolidating accounts or starting fresh. I told her starting fresh. She smiled and printed the paperwork. It took 25 minutes. I did not tell Sylvia. I did not tell Philip. I did not tell anyone. I just changed the direct deposit routing on my pension the following week, so the monthly payment would go into the new account instead of the one they had access to. I left enough in the old account to cover the remaining auto payments I had not yet tracked down and canceled. A buffer, enough to close it out cleanly once I had worked through the list. That was the first step. The second step happened about 10 days later when I sat down with a legal pad and wrote out everything I wanted to document before the dinner. Not as evidence for a lawsuit, not to wave in anyone's face, just for myself. I needed to see the full shape of it written out in plain language, not buried in spreadsheet rows. I went through the file line by line and pulled out the amounts that had no paper trail, no text agreement, nothing but my memory that they had asked, and I had said yes. The list took up 2 full pages. I looked at it for a long time, then I folded the pages in half and put them in the same drawer where I kept important documents. 3 days before the dinner, I called an attorney. A general practice guy I had used once before for a property matter, nothing complicated. I told him what I had and asked what my options were if I wanted to formally request repayment of unauthorized charges. He said a notarized letter was a reasonable first step, not legally binding in the sense of forcing a judgment, but it created a record and often prompted a response that a phone call or text never would. He said he could draft something simple. I told him to go ahead. The letter would cover the $612 and $45 emergency card charge and the $990 in unreimbursed transfers over the past 90 days. Total request, $1,602,045 and not a threat. Not a lawsuit filing, just a written record with a 30-day response window and his firm's letterhead at the top. He said it would be ready in about a week. That was fine. I was not in a hurry. The evening before the dinner, I called the restaurant and asked to speak with someone about the reservation. When they confirmed the booking under Sylvia's name, I asked one quiet question. Was it possible to request a separate check for one guest at the time of ordering? The woman said, of course, just let the server know when you arrive. I thanked her and hung up. That was the last thing I needed to arrange. The next evening, I got there early, chose the booth by the window, and told the server when he came over that I would be on a separate check. He wrote it down without any expression and moved on. Simple as that. When the folder came and landed at my elbow the way it always did, I already knew mine was sitting separately in his pocket, already settled. $37 even. I had brought exact cash. There was nothing left to wait for. After I walked out, I sat in my car for about 10 minutes before starting the engine. Not because I was upset, more because I had not sat in complete quiet for that long in a while and it felt worth holding on to. The parking lot was mostly empty on that side. A light in the restaurant window cast a pale stripe across the pavement. I could see shapes of people moving inside but could not make out faces. I started the car and drove home. The house was exactly as I had left it. I hung up my coat, turned on the kitchen light, and sat down at the table with my laptop. That was when I found the charge on the emergency card, $612, $155. Less than 2 hours after I had walked out of that restaurant. I looked at that number for a while. Then I pulled up the spreadsheet and started working through the list I had prepared. First, I removed Philip's access to the shared card. That took less than 3 minutes in the app settings. Then I went into the utility account and canceled the auto payment running to their address. Then I logged into the grocery delivery app and removed the recurring order being shipped to their house on my card. Then I changed the password on the account so it could not be re-added without my involvement. Each step took about 3 minutes. The whole thing was done in under 20 minutes. When I finished, I closed the laptop and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet. No phone, no TV. Just the tick of the clock on the wall. I was not feeling triumphant about any of it. I was not angry either. I was just done. Done in the way you feel after finishing a task that has been sitting on your list far too long, not exciting, just complete. I poured a small glass of water, drank it standing at the sink, and went to bed. The next morning, my phone rang at 8:04. I was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, watching the light come through the backyard window. I looked at the screen before answering. Philip. I picked up. Leonard. He only used my first name when he was working up to something. I need to talk to you about last night. You embarrassed Sylvia in front of the whole table, in front of the kids. I let him finish. He went on for another minute or so. Something about how I could have just said something privately instead of making a scene. Something about how the kids were confused. Something about how Sylvia had not slept well and was upset this morning. When he stopped talking, I said, I paid for mine. That was all, then I hung up. I set the phone face down on the table and sat there for a while. The coffee was still warm. A bird was doing something in the oak tree at the back of the yard. I did not feel rattled by the call the way I might have a year ago. Philip's version of that conversation was built to put me on the defensive, to make the dinner about my behavior instead of the pattern that led to it. I had been on the receiving end of that framing before, and I had let it work on me. Not this time. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, got dressed. Then I called the attorney to confirm the letter was on track. He said it would be ready by end of week. 10 days after the dinner, a sealed envelope went out in the morning mail to Sylvia and Philip's address, my return address on the label. Inside was the letter his office had prepared, printed on firm letterhead, signed and notarized. It laid out the $612.45 in emergency card charge and the $990 in transfers from the previous 90 days. Total requested $1,602.45, and the language was plain and direct. It was not a lawsuit. It was not a threat. It was a written request for repayment with a 30-day window to respond. The attorney had told me it might not result in full repayment. I told him that was not entirely the point. The point was that for the first time in 3 years, what had happened was written down somewhere official, signed, dated, notarized. Not sitting quietly in a spreadsheet only I would ever read. Not floating around in my memory with no weight behind it. I dropped the envelope in the blue collection box outside the post office and walked back to my car. That was it. No phone call to warn them, no follow-up text. Just a letter, sent and done. 3 days later, Sylvia showed up at my front door. No call ahead. She never called ahead. She had her sunglasses on even though the sky outside was overcast, which I had noticed she tended to do when she was preparing for something she did not want fully visible on her face. I stepped aside and let her in. Put the kettle on. Set out 2 mugs, the good ones with the blue trim that I kept in the back of the cabinet and usually only brought out when someone came over. She sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room the way she always did when she visited, like she was checking whether anything had changed. "You didn't have to send a letter like that," she said. "It felt like something you'd send to a stranger." "I know," I said. I poured the water and set the mugs on the table. "Philip is angry. He thinks you're trying to make us look bad. The letter was straightforward," I said. Nothing in it was untrue. She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked down at it. "We just always figured you had it handled. You never said anything was a problem." "I know," I said. "That part was on me too." She looked up at that. I think she expected me to soften or to push harder, and when I did, neither she did, not quite know where to take it next. We sat there for a moment without talking. She did not drink her tea. I drank mine. "You could have just told us," she said again. "Quieter this time. I'm telling you now," I said. She stayed another few minutes, checked her phone once, made a comment about needing to get the kids. When she stood up, I walked her to the door. At the threshold, she stopped, and I thought she was going to say something that might have opened a real conversation. But she looked at the floor, then back up, and whatever it was, she decided to leave it where it was. "I'll talk to Philip," she said. "Okay," I said. I closed the door and stood in the front hallway for a moment. I waited to feel something. Some pull toward calling her back, some wave of regret about how the whole thing had gone. It did not come. What came instead was a low, steady calm. The kind that comes not from winning anything, but from finally being straight about something that needed to be said. I cleared the mugs, wiped down the table. Then I went into the garage and turned on the shop light. The cabinet project had been sitting in pieces for almost 2 years. Solid oak, meant for the back wall of the garage, dovetailed joints throughout. I had gotten about a third of the way through it before life kept filling up the hours I had set aside for it. Not big interruptions, just the steady accumulation of other people's needs coming first. I pulled on my work gloves, checked the joints I had dry fitted the week before, and got back to it. The wood was cool under my hands. The shop smelled like sawdust and machine oil, 2 of my favorite smells. I put on an old playlist low in the background and worked through the late afternoon without checking my phone once. At some point, I poured a measure of bourbon from a bottle I had been saving for no particular reason and set it on the corner of the workbench. Took a sip. Kept working. It was the first evening in a long time that felt completely like mine. Neither of them called that week. I left my phone on the kitchen counter most evenings and went into the garage. The cabinet was coming along. The dovetail joints on the upper frame were fitting the way I wanted them to, tight and clean, the kind of fit that does not need glue to hold. I worked a few hours each evening after dinner and found that I was sleeping better than I had in months. I was not waiting for Sylvia to call. I was not rehearsing what I would say if Philip tried again. I was just building a cabinet one piece at a time in my own garage on my own schedule. That Saturday, I drove 3 hours north to a lake I used to fish with my father when I was a kid. I had not been back in at least 15 years. I found a small cabin rental online, nothing fancy, a single room above a bait shop with a window that looked out over the water. I checked in Friday evening, made a simple dinner in the small kitchen, and was on the dock by 6 the next morning with a thermos of coffee and a rod I had not used in longer than I could remember. I caught 2 smallmouth bass before 9. Released both, sat on the dock until almost noon just watching the water. No agenda, nobody else's timeline to fit around. No texts to answer, just the lake and the coffee and the occasional sound of a boat engine somewhere out in the distance. On the drive home Sunday afternoon, I had the window down and the radio on low. Nothing in particular, just whatever was playing. The drive was 3 hours, and I did not feel the need to fill it with anything. I thought about my father a little, about how he used to say that a man who cannot spend a quiet afternoon by himself is a man who does not know himself very well. I had not thought about that in years. It landed differently now. Back home, I opened my laptop and created a new tab in the spreadsheet. I did not label it with a category or a family member's name. I just typed, for Leonard, clean page, no backlog, no red rows. First entry, Friday cabin, $95 paid in full. Second entry, Saturday breakfast at the dock, 0, made it myself. I formatted both lines to match the rest of the file, saved it, and closed the laptop. Then I went to the kitchen and made a real dinner. Pork chops, roasted potatoes, something green on the side. I had been meaning to cook that meal for weeks, but there had always been something else pulling at the evening, a call to return, a request to sort out. A payment to untangle tonight. There was none of that. Just a quiet kitchen, a cast iron pan heating up on the stove, and enough time to do it right. I ate at the table without the television on. Read for a while after, went to bed at a reasonable hour. In the days that followed, I looked into a few things I had been putting off for no good reason. There was a woodworking group that met on Thursday evenings at the community center a few miles from my house. I had seen the flyer on the board there months ago and thought about it once and then not again. I pulled up their contact and sent a short email asking if they were still taking new members. They wrote back the next morning, said come by any Thursday, no commitment required. I went the following week. About a dozen men, mostly my age or a little older, working on different projects in a big open room that smelled like every good workshop I had ever been in. Nobody asked what I used to do for work or why I was there. They just pointed me to an open bench and went back to what they were doing. I stayed 2 hours and drove home with sawdust on my jeans. I added it to the spreadsheet. For Leonard, annual membership, $60 paid in full. The notarized letter was sitting inside its 30-day window. I was not holding my breath waiting on a response. Whether they replied or not was going to tell me something useful either way, and I was prepared for both. The money mattered, but it was not the whole point. The point was that what had happened over 3 years was now written down somewhere with a signature and a date on it. It existed outside of my memory. It had weight. There's something about putting a number on a thing that makes it real in a way that feelings alone never quite manage. I had felt the cost of those 3 years for a long time. Now I had it on paper. If you're reading this and any part of it sounds familiar, maybe the dinners where the check always ends up in front of you, maybe the requests that arrive with no greeting and no please, maybe the slow drift of other people's expenses into accounts that have your name on them, I want to say something directly. You did not get here because you're weak. You got here because you're the kind of man who shows up, handles things, and does not make a fuss. That is not a character flaw, but it has a cost, and at some point the cost stops being something you agreed to carry. Knowing your own value is not the same as being selfish. It just means you finally did the math. I did the math. And for the first time in a long time, the numbers made sense.